anxiety as. So anxiety is a mental and physical reaction to perceived threats. And the key word there is perceived. Not always threats, but perceived threats. In small doses, anxiety is helpful to protect us from danger and focuses our attention on problems. But when anxiety is too severe or occurs too frequently, it becomes debilitating. So there is a healthy place for anxiety in our lives. I always say I'm one of those weird people that actually like to public speak. But even for me, I public speak all the time and I still get a little bit of that like, ooh, like thing in my stomach, right? But I think that urges us to do well, want to be on. But the challenge is when those feelings overcome us to a point that we're not doing the things that we want to be doing. That's when we usually find that the anxiety piece is becoming a little bit difficult and challenging. So what are some of the symptoms that we see with people that struggle with anxiety? One of the main symptoms is uncontrollable worry, right? When it's just like on our mind, whatever the thing is over and over again. Poor concentration, inability to focus, excessive nervousness. Some of the physical pieces are excessive heart rates, like you wake up in the morning and you're like boom, 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 boom. Sleep problems. A lot of people, anxiety settles in their stomach. I don't know if any of you guys have kids that wake up and it's like, my stomach hurts. I have a middle son like that. I'm like, you're fine. But his anxiety settles in his stomach. I know for me, it's my neck and my back. It's kind of where my stress kind of settles. Muscle tension, avoidance of fears. So what are some of the typical causes of anxiety? So one of the main causes is situations, right? We have job changes, moves, hardships, sickness, challenges with kids, challenges with marriages, a lot of the things that were described on this paper's there. So oftentimes we call that situational anxiety, which makes a lot of sense, right? Anxiety that is connected to a specific situation. Another cause of anxiety is biological or chemical pieces, right? Sometimes we have people that struggle with their chemicals are off in their minds and their brains, and they have a more propensity towards having anxiety. Family history of anxiety, if any of you might have family members, parents, aunts, uncles that have anxiety, there is a higher chance that you might also struggle with anxiety. And then trauma is another reason that we see anxiety, especially childhood trauma, that often can settle in our bodies, settle in our minds. So in our field, we have there's a lot of different diagnoses for anxieties, but the main one is called generalized anxiety disorder. And a lot of people ask us, like, at what point do we diagnose that as opposed to just generalized stress? And it's typically when we see someone having symptoms that are affecting their baseline of functioning. So when the things that they used to be able to do without a challenge become difficult. Challenges working, their sleep schedules change significantly, their relationships are shifting because of the amount of anxiety that they're having, is typically when we look at a potential diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder. There's another diagnosis that we have, it's called adjustment disorder with anxiety, and that's typically when we have someone that has a situation, and because of that situation is having anxiety, and when the situation dissipates, the anxiety dissipates as well, where with the generalized anxiety, it's much more of a overall feeling of anxiety that feels that it's unable to be managed. So the next little part here are just some called it anxiety tidbits, but they're things just in working with clients with anxiety that I have kind of seen as principles of people that I work with and things that I see. So one of the phrases that I often use with my clients is that anxiety only lives in the past and in the future. So if you all think about the things that stress you out, it almost never occurs that it's things that stress us out are the things that we're doing right now, right? Most of our anxiety lies in what we think is going to happen or what happened in the past that we're ruminating over, thinking over and over again. So oftentimes what I encourage clients to do is to bring themselves back to the present when they have anxiety going on, right? So when they're thinking about the shoulda, coulda, wouldas of the past or what's going to be, what should be, and we're kind of spiraling in both of those spaces, I encourage clients to try to come back to the present because anxiety almost never lives in the present. And I know for myself, when I bring myself back into the present, it's like, okay, that anxiety dissipates. When I start to think about tomorrow or next week or next year or 50 years from now, the anxiety is going up and up and up and up and up. So another one that I love that a friend of mine who is a writer and a therapist coined this phrase, and I think it is huge when it comes to working with anxiety. And it says, practicing disappointment does not prepare us for it. And I love that phrase because I think many of us have the unconscious belief that if we play out all the worst case scenarios of what could possibly happen in our lives, that somehow we'll be emotionally prepared for them, right? Like if I could think about what possibly could happen and all the terrible things with my kids or my husband or my job or my life, then like when that thing happens, although those are like endless possibilities, but when that thing happen, like I will be emotionally prepared for it. And I have come from a life with some trauma in it. And I can tell you that that was not expected trauma. And I don't think no matter how I would have prepared for it, it would have mattered. And so all I tell people is that what practicing disappointment does is it just distracts us from the present, right? It doesn't allow us to be present with the things that are going on right now because we're so busy worrying about what we think might happen. And when we get to those things anyway, we're not usually prepared by disappointment. So the next one I say is called the ruminating tape recorder. Has anybody had the ruminating tape recorder? So we call that like different phrases or different thoughts that just loop in our minds over and over again, right? Like they get stuck in there and the tape recorder plays over and over and over again. And typically speaking, and I don't know for any of you if you find this to be true, but for most people I work with, I find that those tape recorders seem to be most intensified in the mornings and at night. And the reason for that is that is when our defenses are the lowest, and it's also when there's no distractions, right? So as moms, we have distractions like 99% of the day. But it's those like very, very early mornings. I had one of those mornings, I was up at 5. I don't know why. Or the like late night when like finally the last kid went to sleep, and then you're like, I just want to be at peace. And what happens? Like tape recorder's going. And you're like, I want the tape recorder to stop. And so one of the tools, and these are like very simplistic things I always tell my clients, I'm like, it doesn't sound like rocket science, but sometimes it's the simplest things that's the hardest to put into place. And so for myself, I literally visualize putting my thoughts on a shelf, and I tell myself, like, I will pick up those things tomorrow. Because I don't know about you all, but when my anxiety spikes at 2 a.m. about the email I need to write or the phone call I didn't make or the appointment I need to make, like the chances of me doing them at 2 o'clock in the morning are about 0, right? I'm not waking up and calling the doctor at 2 a.m. unless it's a real emergency. And I'm not writing the email to the person I need to write the email to. And so I always remind myself, like, this is unproductive anxiety at 2 a.m. I'm going to put it on the shelf, and it will be there when I pick it up at 7 a.m. or 9 a.m. or whatever that is. But I think sometimes we actually need that visualization of like, this is going there, I'm going to put it there, and it's not going anywhere. I promise you, it'll be there tomorrow. And so sometimes I just find like the visualization of us being able to tangibly understand what anxiety looks like is helpful. The next part that I put here is just a little bit about anxiety and postpartum. So I know many of us have heard about postpartum depression. That's something that we all fill out the survey, which I have my own thoughts about those surveys, but 6 weeks or whatever it is, after the day after, I think, and then 6 weeks after, as if we know what's going on at that point. But what is not very well talked about, but is actually more prevalent than postpartum depression, is postpartum anxiety. And it's interesting because if you think about it, it's kind of like a no duh, because our hormones are changing just like with postpartum depression. We have brought a brand new life into the world that we are now responsible for, even if we've done that multiple times. And our life has completely shifted, right? So a major situation on top of hormonal and chemical changes that are occurring. And so oftentimes we see, and a lot of times people ask, like, what's the difference again between postpartum anxiety, where it's diagnosable, or we need to get another layer of care for it, versus typical new mom needing anxiety. And the questions that I ask people to a little bit differentiate are questions like, are you staying awake all night because you're afraid your baby will stop breathing in their sleep? So you're not able to calm down and sleep when your baby's sleeping. Are you terrified to leave your baby alone for a few minutes with an adult you trust? Being so afraid that someone will hurt you or your child that the thought of leaving your house makes your heart race. So again, kind of similar to the generalized anxiety, we usually see it when our complete baseline of functioning has changed, when the things that we know instinctively, okay, I should be able to leave the house, like those things we're not doing because that anxiety is so overwhelming and we're trying to appease the anxiety. So it's when the worry level is so excessive that we're starting to make big accommodations for it. And then we're not seeing the anxiety decrease. So many of the signs of postpartum depression also overlap with postpartum anxiety, like disturbed sleep, feeling afraid, heart palpitations. And it's also common that postpartum depression and anxiety go hand in hand. So again, if anyone has experienced or is experiencing postpartum anxiety, it's one of those things, unfortunately, you probably have to bring up to your healthcare provider rather than them talking to you about it. It is becoming more talked about, but it's something that is good to be aware of, especially for friends or family members. Postpartum depression is not the only challenge that we see post-pregnancy. So, okay, then the next part is talking about a little bit about parental anxiety. Does anybody have parental anxiety? Anybody worry about their kids ever? Never? So one of the things that we see in parental anxiety, or that I see oftentimes as one of the challenges with moms that I work with, is when our anxiety gets in the way of us allowing our kids to learn independence and freedom. Right? So we've heard of those terms, helicopter parent, hover parent. I don't love those words, but it's that sense of like, we are not allowing the next natural step of what childhood development is supposed to be because we're afraid of, like, on the playground that they're gonna, gonna fall or hurt themselves. And I always tell parents, like, there's this fine line of like responsibility, like we're responsible for our children, but responsibility is different than anxiety. And anxiety is when we're trying to appease our internal angst by our decisions rather than kind of following the things that we know to be true. So again, what are some things that we see that can be a little bit challenging in parental anxiety? Sometimes avoiding putting a child in what we know is a safe situation, but we perceive it as harmful. I see that at the playground a lot. It's like, I think your child's capable of going up the stairs, but the parent's right behind them. And the challenge is that oftentimes when we're projecting that anxiety in our kids, it's a challenging ripple effect, right? Instead of encouraging independence, perseverance, all of those things. Another one that I often see in parents is when they start to vocalize their excessive worry of fear and stress to other people and their children. So a lot of times I see clients with anxiety, one of their release mechanisms is to talk about it. And there's a healthy way to do that. But also, I don't know if you've ever met people or friends or yourself that do the check. I call it the checks. Like, you think that's okay? Like, are you sure? You think I'm doing the right thing? You think I'm making the right decision? I call that like the double check. And when we're doing that excessively, it's oftentimes because we're not trusting ourselves, right? We're not trusting that we have the capability to make the decisions for our kids or ourselves. And again, there's wisdom in talking to friends and asking for advice. But when we don't trust ourselves because the anxiety is too high, that's sometimes when we want to just be aware. Another one that we often see is having persistent thoughts that something bad could happen to your child, right? Again, playing out those worst case scenarios of whether it's social relationships or illnesses or all of those things. And obviously, most of us in here have had kids through COVID times. So, no stress there. And then the other one is excessive time spent worrying about the little details related to your kids, right? Like every little decision or choice or thing that they're doing, we're spending an extraordinary amount of time trying to make a decision or processing. The other one, I think somebody alluded to in here, what's one of the big stems that I see related to parental anxiety, and that is the rise of social media, right? And what I see is, and probably even more so since COVID, is like we just have too much access, right? So the challenge of the world of 2023 is globalization, and there's wonderful things about that, but it used to be that we only knew about things like in our community and maybe our state and maybe our country. Well, now we know about every tragedy and every catastrophe literally around the world 24/7. again, no duh that we have anxiety raising. And it's this feeling as if we need to be responsible or should be responding to all these things happening, which is just an impossibility. But the challenge is because they're on our radar screen, because they're on our news feed or on Facebook or whatever it is, they're coming into our frame of reference, and things that we wouldn't even had known to have anxiety about, all of a sudden, boom, there's the thought, oh, I didn't even know that was something I should be stressed about. Now I'm stressed about it. And obviously the other piece with social media that I'm sure none of you experience is that comparison factor, right? The comparison to what the other family's Christmas pictures. I've been done them in 12 years. I just chose that not doing them. Nobody expects them then. Full surprise one year. The family that looks put together, right? That I call it the shoulds of moms. Ooh, I should be doing it. I should be taking the professional picture with my kids. I should be attending that event. I should be having the birthday party that, the entire class is invited to. And it's that idea of like, okay, things that, we could be going about our day, one scroll on social media, pop, all these anxiety thoughts that 5 minutes ago weren't necessarily in there. And so, I know for myself, for lots of moms, it's, a touch point, there's access, but it's also just being aware that I think we can all probably agree the rise of social media has significantly contributed to an increase in anxiety for people. So that's the piece on anxiety, and now I'm going to give you some tips and tools, because I always like to tell myself, I like to think that I'm a pretty practical therapist. I like people walking away with things they can actually tangibly take on. So we'll talk to the first one, which hits on my last point, which is compartmentalize the time that you spend on social media. So I know for myself, I actually spoke at a MOPS group pretty recently, and we were actually talking about Apple Watches, funny enough. I was like super resistant to get an Apple Watch because I was like, I don't need one more point of access. And it's funny, it's such a simple thing, but for me, it's actually shifted me being on my phone way less. Because with the type of job I have, like I need some kind of access point, but now I can look down in 2 seconds, see the message, decide if it's something I need to respond to or not. And instead of having my big clunky phone with my kids watching me and then going from a message to, oh, Facebook's right there, Instagram's right there, it's like, oh, my kids can not, like for 2 seconds, they don't really see this, but they certainly see this. And so it has allowed me to just kind of have the freedom of, having the phone call that I need or access to my husband or whatever without all the other stuff that's attached. And for me, I keep my Apple Watch pretty simply for phone calls and texts and not much else. And it's funny because it actually was way more freeing than I thought it would be, because it's just helped me remind myself like there's so much on my phone that I just don't need, and the stress of that. Okay, so the next one I said is to moderate your news intake. I'm not a family really that has news flying in the background, but it does fly up on my phone. And again, it's that idea of like access, and like we obviously live in a fairly volatile world and a challenging climate, in 2023 in our own country. And so it can be wearing to be a parent, right? All that anxiety of, my gosh, like having kids in this day and age and all the things that they face that maybe it feels like we didn't, can feel really overwhelming. And so, just being mindful of how much we're consuming and how much we're intaking, I really think can free us from some of that anxiety. We want to be aware, right? We don't want to be hermits that live in a hole, but we also don't want to like have this consumption that feels overwhelming. And I don't know about you, I know for myself, especially when I'm with my kids, like it can be so easy to be interacting with them and playing and being in their world, and then just like one look at the phone of who knows what, and my mind is instantly taken to something completely different, and now I'm distracted, or I'm stressed out, or I didn't have that piece of information 30 seconds ago and I was okay with that, but now that I do, I need to do something about it. I think that it's important to recognize how much we're actually consuming and what that does to us. So the next one, and you're going to laugh at this, but I'm going to say it anyway. is as much as you can add a little bit extra sleep. And I know a lot of you, I see lots of new moms here, and I'm a little bit more removed from that now. But I know as a mom that like at the end of the day when it's like, oh, thank God, the last one finally went to bed. I'm like, I just want to like binge watch whatever. I like cooking shows, so Top Chef is my binge watch. And what I find real quick is like that 30 minutes turns into an hour, turns into 2 hours. Because like really, how much time do we have without like a husband here or or kids right there? Not that much. But I know for myself, my gosh, the days that I wake up after, having like a little bit too much release time, I feel like groggy and my stress levels are higher and I feel overwhelmed. So I will say this for myself. I have been trying to, for myself, when like my body says like, you're done, I'm trying to listen to that and not push it like just one more show, just one more thing, or just like one more set of dishes, and kind of honor myself and knowing that like that little bit of extra like really does make a big difference. Okay, the next one I put is memorizing and meditating on scripture. So this is my favorite verse, one of my favorite verses, and I don't know if any of you are familiar in the therapy world, but one of the forms of therapy that is often utilized is called cognitive behavioral therapy. It's often what's used with anxiety, and it's about training our thoughts to then change our behaviors. And I joke with clients, Christian or not, that this verse is the original CBT verse, that it was designed by God before any psychologist got involved. And it's 2 Corinthians 10:5, and it says, we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. And I love this verse because it shows us that we have the power to actually change our thoughts. Right? We have the power to take a thought and not let it run away. So an analogy I use with a lot of my clients is if we can recognize the negative or unhealthy or anxious thought right when it comes in, we have the opportunity to either pluck it out, or we can water it and grow it and water it and grow it. And the more we do that, the more it takes over. But what's really hard, I don't know if you've ever had this happen, but like there's times I'll be staring at the wall and it's like, oh man, for like 20 minutes, I just let my thoughts just run away with themselves. But if I can catch it at the beginning of the thought and take it out and let it be captive and lay it down at God's feet, then it's like, oh, okay, I don't have to go through all the spiralies that often happen with thoughts. Another great verse, again, ones that you've probably heard many times, is Philippians 4:6-7. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, which passes all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Jesus Christ. So I love these because anxiety is not new, right? I mean, like it's way back from like this from the fall. And so I love the fact that it's addressed biblically speaking. And the last one, which loops back to some of the principles I talked about before, is Matthew 6:34. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has trouble of its own. So I love this because I call myself, I'm a therapist who's a Christian. I work with both Christians and not Christians, but like biblical principles, they interweave into everything I do, whether the client knows that or not. And a lot of the foundational pieces that I work with come right from these verses. So the next tip is practice mindfulness. I think mindfulness is like a scary word for people. What is mindfulness? And I think it's just a time where it allows us, again, to be like right back in that present moment, like but being very prepared to do that. So there's two very simple tools that I'll share with you. And the first one is called the 5-4-3-2-1 grounding technique. So this is when, again, we're in those like spirally thoughts. We call it like if we're starting to catastrophize about the future, thinking about all the worst case things, and we want to bring ourselves back to the present. It's easy, 5-4-3-2-1. So the first one is in our chair, at home on our bed, in our whatever we're doing. It's looking at 5 things that you can see around you, so visually. 4 things that you can hear. This thing, babies, cracklings. 3 things that you can feel tangibly, my dress, my hair on the back of my neck. 2 things that you can smell, and then 1 thing that you can taste. And it sounds, again, some of these things sound so simplistic, but the reason we encourage people to do this is because it's impossible to do the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 and be thinking about like what happened yesterday or what's happening in 5 minutes from now. Like it forces us to come back to the right now and do something that we have to focus on in the present. The other tool that I use is something called square breathing. So I know a lot of times people talk about mindfulness and they'll say, take deep breaths. And it's like, is that helpful? And I will tell you, I've been a poo-pooer of some of these myself over the years, but the more I learn about them and practice them, you can see the benefits. So square breathing is intentional breathing. So it's beginning by exhaling all your air, inhaling for 4 seconds, holding for 4 seconds, exhaling for 4 seconds, and holding for 4 seconds. So square, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4. And the reason I like this rather than just deep breathing is as we're counting in 1, 2, 3, 4, hold 1, 2, 3, 4, exhale 1, 2, 3, 4, hold 1, 2. Again, it brings us into the present. We can't really think about the things that we're stressing about before and after because we're focusing on the breathing, but we're also focusing on the counting at the same time. The next two are kind of, together, exercising and going outside. It's a lot easier having this talk in May than it's having it in December. So, get out there with your kids, be physical, like 20 minutes of physical activity can like pump up your serotonin levels naturally, get some vitamin D. I'm a busy working mom, so, sometimes easier to say than to practice, but I've been trying to be very intentional, especially if my kids are a little bit older ages. So now I just join them on the bike ride, or, I try not to just sit at the softball game. I try to kind of get some activity in, but it is natural ways to kind of reduce that anxiety, let the stress of the day go, take a deep breath and kind of reset. The next one's very appropriate for the group here, which is connecting with friends, right? Like social support, as you all know, of moms is extremely important. When we're alone is usually typically when we see anxiety to be highest because we have no filter and no distraction. And having healthy friends can help us kind of manage our anxiety and also normalize it to some extent. Like, oh, you're not the only one stressing about what your kids like doing or what we're doing for the holidays. So there's a normalizing, but there's also just healthy connection with friends. And then the last one I have here is channeling your anxiety, which is, I love this phrase. It says, if you're thinking about it, just do it. So I don't know about you all, but like, I think sometimes we all have like good intentions and we stress about the intentions. We're never doing the thing actually. So for my own life, I've come to a place, it's like, if my mind is thinking about it, like I'm just gonna do the thing, even if I don't like the thing that I have to do, because all that time stressing about it is just consuming me and I'm getting nothing accomplished anyway. And if I just, like for me, it's like the uncomfortable phone call. Okay, if I just make the uncomfortable phone call, then it's done and it's over and I'm not building and building and building into this terrible, awful thing that I'm just pushing off further and further and further. And then the end here, I just put like, what do you do if you need more support? And if you do, that is okay. And I encourage you to reach out and get extra help if needed. So usually, again, as I said to the beginning, when is it helpful to reach out, whether that's to a doctor or a therapist or a friend? And again, I think it's usually like, if we know ourselves and we know our baseline, it's when we find ourselves just being constantly consumed. Right, when all the time it's the consumption of the thoughts coming through. And again, two helpful ways is reaching out to a therapist or if needed. Oh yeah. So sorry, no, it's very rude interruption. No, you're totally fine. We have a car situation with construction issue outside that we just need some immediate. No, you're good. We just have a really large truck trying to get off. So we have two vehicles that we parked on Libby Avenue in front of a Harps that was doing construction. It looks like this, and I have the license plate, but it's a Ford, like dark silver, gray, KU 365D. Anybody? And then like a light Toyota. Any person from the George? Okay. They just, for sure, one of them needs to move because they just can't get in out. Sorry. No, you're totally fine. So yes, we don't want any vehicle catastrophes. So again, I find for many clients, like therapy can be very helpful, and just having, I always say, like a neutral space that isn't attached to anybody. I always joke with my clients, the benefit of me is I don't go home with you, right? I'm not your mom, I'm not your husband, I'm not your kids. So I think a lot of people benefit from having that space to be able to say things that they might not say to people that are in their frame of reference all the time. And again, we're trained, of course, to do special, like certain techniques and tools to be able to actually address how to change our brains and thinking. And then again, if needed, I am a big proponent of medication when necessary. There is certainly a chemical component to anxiety, and sometimes when our serotonin and dopamine are depleted, we can't just will our way into that going higher. And so, you know, if I'm going to stick around for a little bit after. So if anybody has personal questions, feel free to connect with me. Again, I am a therapist that has my own practice. I have an office in Basking Ridge, Lincoln Park, and then I also do virtual. And I also just hired my first male therapist. And he specializes in working with couples and with males. So he's a nice counterbalance to me. So I enjoyed this. If anybody has questions, I'm going to open it up. If anybody has questions for me, or we can talk on the tables. But does anybody have any questions related to any of what I said? That would be helpful.
Just like a technical question.
Sure. So the number one question. So I'm out of network with insurance. So as I say, that's between you and your insurance, but I give everything that would needed if you have out of network to be reimbursed. Any other questions on anxiety stuff? Nobody's mind this, can I? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
My mom counts till 7, so you said breathe in for 4, hold the breath for 4. She said hold it till 7, and one time I did the 7. That sounds like
Don't do it till you pass out. That's not helpful. Yes, we want you to have air. So yes, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4, square. No, we need oxygen. Essential. So I work with 15 and above, so high school, college, and beyond. So I used to work with smaller children back in the day, but as I have my own, it's a little much to work with all the same age range. I do. I have both. So I'm going to leave cards out also on the table here, but it's just riseupcc.com is the website, and then Instagram is just Rise Up Counseling Center. So, and again, I will stick around for a little while. Thankfully, all my kids are in school right now. So if you have any other personal questions or something else I can help support with, please feel free to reach out. Thank you.